to continue our session with the psychological aspect, I would like to call upon Dr. Yaakov Stein from the Israeli Center of... Perhaps because I'm the youngest of all speakers, I would deviate from the norm and the convention and what is more efficient, and I will not be reading from papers. Can you hear me? Okay. I also deviate in a certain sense, another sense, because I shift from the collective space and the national collective guilt to the psychological sphere, the personal sphere. And in that sense, I'm a bit embarrassed because I do not know if I can teach you anything new. I do not know if I can teach you anything new because, you know, we all have a psyche. And perhaps we can do it by, you know, a show of hand. Who ever has experienced any shame in their lives? And as you probably noticed, it comes as no surprise. As you probably noticed, my presentation does not include only shame, but also guilt. And Professor Gross talked about the fact that literature distinguishes between the two. And this is a very important distinction, and we're going to touch upon it more deeply, but with a show of hands. Again, have you ever experienced guilt in your lives? A lot fewer of you. Or perhaps, you know, your hands have gotten tired. But I think, and we'll see it later on, I believe, that it's so hard to distinguish between the two in our experience. That, you know, gentleman who painfully cried out, and the pain enters the heart because words that come out of the heart enter the heart. And also Professor Gross's words, who left the heart and entered the heart. Did his words raise guilt or shame? I believe that these are questions that we must tackle, and we'll try to distinguish between them. I'll touch upon the distinction between shame and guilt and their relevance to one another. And then I will touch upon different, you know, aspects of their traumatic or post-traumatic dimensions, and then I'll try to see how we can leverage these feelings, or which are, you know, of them are leveraging us to more positive realms. So literature is trying to divide between shame and guilt as separate feelings, as separate experiences. And when we convene here around the issue of shame, we nonetheless, and I go back to Professor Gross's words, which will contrast what I'm about to say. Are we not focusing on guilt? Or for that matter, you know, emerging from Professor Gross's words, it appears that there's an attempt to perpetuate guilt or shame. If shame is lost, what will become of us? And I wonder whether we're merely trying to perpetuate guilt. And let's try to think about this, because shame is an emotional state that we're in, and it's an inner conflict in which certain ethical or moral places were experienced in a certain way, and they're in a certain conflict with who we are or a certain conduct that we have performed. Guilt is a lot more than that. It's something that we take upon ourselves and who we are, and it has ramifications on our responses. It looks different. It is experienced in a different way. If you will, this is what we would have liked to do when we feel that we are ashamed, to hide, to conceal, to eliminate. And if you look at the verse, which is there before each and every one of you, this quote from the Bible, you know, we are ashamed because we have heard reproach, disgrace hath covered our faces. Shame has us meet such an intolerable place because we don't want anyone else to see us in it. And what happens when there's guilt? We have this wish to make amends. We have this wish to take that deed, which is so flawed and wrong, and to do something to correct it, something to change it, something that would bring about a different situation. Because it is not that I'm totally and utterly flawed, but there's something about reality that has been done that needs to be corrected. And if we are in the context of the Shoah or the Holocaust, we can always ask if there's anything that can actually right such a great wrong, something so big and great and incomparable. But again, I think, and I will argue, that the very question comes from a place of guilt, not necessarily a place of shame. However, we are experiencing these together. If I were to tell you or ask you not only who experienced shame and guilt, but anything that was either, guilt or shame, but is not exactly sure which of the two it was, I'm not that certain what the answer would be, because they do go hand in hand. They do lead to opposite directions. On the one hand, they both lead us to hard places of depression, of fear of being exposed. Shame is truly done vis-a-vis the other. The fear that the others would judge me because they see what I have in me. And then who am I and what value do I have? And that is accompanied with a sense of, worthlessness, as I will show later on. And guilt will lead us to places of correcting of that wrong. But the two together lead to a place of convergence, a place of isolation. Terrible isolation. And we'll talk later about different types of shames and different types of guilt. But as Professor Gross said, and she touched upon very profound psychological elements, when we feel these emotions, when we experience any of them, it's hard to communicate them. It's hard to talk about them. It's hard to expose them. So we are sort of withdrawing ourselves. We're isolating ourselves. We are within ourselves, and we're eating ourselves up, as it were, because of these experiences. If we look at these mechanisms, turning the face away, avoiding touch and contact, lowering our gaze, bending over, we can each identify ourselves in those places where we encountered those experiences, that sense of withdrawal, that sense that nobody should see us, woe on us if that disgrace is to be exposed. And that leads us to those traumatic places of trauma. Guilt and shame are both aspects of the post-traumatic reality. Not always. People talked about the fact that there's always a preliminary response of silence and withdrawal, but the responses to trauma are diverse. There are those who would immediately talk and those who would immediately remain silent. There's so many responses. Some would feel shame, others wouldn't. The post-traumatic reality is one in which a person is haunted by his or her past. It is a situation in which the thoughts take the individuals back to those places. The trauma enters the cognitive and emotional world of a person, whether he is awake or asleep. Trauma brings about a situation in which the individual is restless. He or she are constantly wakeful because there's this event in their lives which was so significant and so terrible, and it can be terrible in so many different ways, which is present even though it came to an end. And shame and guilt are a part of it. They come with those very sentiments, with the dysfunctionality of people who are post-traumatic so very often. And they contain an emotional, mixed up and confused world, which is very, very varied, of feelings that actually paralyze, of fear, of guilt for the fact that I survived, guilt for the fact, and we'll soon see it in the other direction, of what I did. And indeed, when we talk about trauma, when a patient comes to the clinic, a person who participated in battle or was a part of a certain activity or an occurrence like the Holocaust or any other massacre, and the differences are incredibly important. But for that matter, when a person was a part of these occurrences, it can be in one of the two of those positions. It can be the victim, and he can be the aggressor, and he can be both. The soldier who returns from battle, who was a part of actions that he could not agree with morally, is both the victim and the aggressor. And the same applies for the Judenrat. However, shame and guilt experienced by these people is different from the position they're in. The victim can feel guilt for the fact that he didn't do enough to prevent the incident, for the fact that he or she survived whereas the others did not, for the fact that they are here today and the others are not. And could they do anything else? Could perhaps, would it be better off if he or she died? And I can hear this from people who underwent these traumas that say, why didn't that bullet hit me? Why did the bullet hit the one in the nearby trench and not me? This week, I talked to a person who was redeemed from captivity. He was a prisoner of war in the war of attrition. And he said that from the entire captivity, what haunts him is a minute before when I lied, right next to someone, and he told me to move to the right, and the next bullet hit him. So that was the victim. And he can feel that he's ashamed of the fact that something was wrong about him because he survived, because he is here today. Whereas the aggressor, his sense of shame and guilt, we can a lot more easily understand. He or she are the people who operated against the moral edict, mine, yours, his, hers. He or she are the individual facing the present and tormenting themselves for what they did in the past. And in that sense, there's a common denominator between the two. Two are fully linked with something that took place in the past, but carries on haunting them to this very day. And when we talk about guilt and shame, collective shame and collective guilt, then it is some sort of a social structuralization that we're doing in order to say that the individual, the personal recognition, the private personal pain is identified with who we are. Each of us has many identities, and we'll touch upon this later on, but I identify myself with a collective that did something that I cannot possibly bear. And this is a terrible feeling, because how much control do I have over what the collective does? Not only that, but these reminders of the event that I'm so ashamed of or feeling so guilty about are all around us all the time. I was not sure that much. On the screen there's an empty space, and there was a poster of the Schindler List. And indeed, this is exactly the place to talk about the guilt and shame and the reminders around the Schindler's List. And the words of Professor Gross illustrated the need to make this guilt and shame present so much. And that is a question. What type of shame and what type of guilt do we want to make present? And which ones do we want to perpetrate and retain? And I, as a psychologist, whenever I encounter the guilty individual or the individual who feels that shame, and I have no doubt that he or she are feeling remorse, because without that remorse there's no shame nor guilt. Without a sense of that which happened is wrong, it does not reconcile with what I deem is right, there's no shame and there's no guilt. So, am I interested in perpetrating their guilt and shame or not? Perpetuating their guilt and shame. And now we move over to another point in which we're asking ourselves, is it possible to have a turning point. Is it the right thing to do? Should we take those terrible feelings, those feelings that, by the way, very often are related to depression, such deep depression that leads to suicidalism? And do you make that turning point? Do you make that change in those places? And one way of actually making that change is trying to right the wrong, trying to actually make atonement, to find the victim and say, look, I want to pursue your good. And it's not only for you, it's for me. I want to do you good because I cannot live with a person that I am and knowing that a part of me wanted to do you harm. And the question whether we can correct or right such a huge phenomenon such as the Holocaust will continue to hover way up there in the air for eternity. But there is this attempt, and when we work with people who experience guilt and shame, we would always want to find those places that would allow them, at least in the intrapersonal space, to reach some sort of a reconciliation, to know that they are working against that place that withdraws themselves from others, and to actually emerge into a space that allows them for recovery. But beside that, I would like to argue that we can also grow. And in order to grow, we need to have a bit of, change in our perception of what human identity is. We tend to think about ourselves as one holistic unit that includes so many things, but there's this one thing that is flawed in a state of shame or guilt. But psychological literature from the relational approaches, or the intersubjective ones, between the subject that I am and the subject I face, between me and the others, talk about multiple selves. I have so many components of self and so many components of identities, and each contributes to who I am, but each of them is in a certain way separate. And that's a way of presenting things better than an ontological reality. But when we understand this, we're beginning to understand that shame is a place that has some sort of a self of mine that I am not interested in touching. I want to be distanced from it. I want to seclude it. I want to ward it off. And that is called dissociation. It's a state of self that I'm disconnected from, that I don't want to be in touch with. I don't dare be in touch with. But that is exactly the place from which I can grow. Because it is exactly the place from which I can start to do the reconciliation that I want to do within me. It is that place that I want to say that is a certain self. It is a self that I find hard to accept, but there are other selves as well that are better from it. And I would want to keep them. And from them, I will start getting in touch with that flawed self that I find hard to accept. And I will start connecting the two. And this connection comes from the understanding that those places, those non-photogenic places of shame and guilt within ourselves that lead us to isolation, are the ones that we are the most vulnerable in. They are the ones that we are under the perusing eye of myself and the others in society. Hence, we're so anxious about them, because we are vulnerable in an inconceivable way. It is there that our soft underbelly is, when that guy stood and accused us. I felt those places within me, that place that asks, am I a part of all this? Am I silencing? Am I voicing? Am I denying? Am I acting? Those places wake up, and they are in a turmoil, and we need courage to touch them. And the paradox that it is those most vulnerable places in us are the ones that can attest to our courage more than anything else. These are the places that we can approach and say, look, I am exposed. I am vulnerable. I am imperfect. And this is the human state. The human state is that of imperfection. And our ability of witnessing, standing before others with our imperfection is our ability to grow, is our ability to accept ourselves, is our ability to take one step forward without ruling out the correction that needs to be made, but with that place that can accept myself in a fuller way. It is that place that takes shame, which has isolation and withdrawal in its mechanism, as well as concealment, and leveraging it to a place of coming to terms with that imperfection, coming to terms with the need to change, recognizing the fact that not everything is in our hands. I'm not an omnipotent person. There's so many ugly things in my past which I'm not proud of, and that's an understatement. But judging by your hands, your raised hands, we each have our skeletons in our closet.